Critics supporting the second skin hypothesis may point out that if Paul were defending a traditional resurrection hypothesis, he ought to have used some of the same sorts of proofs as other sources. In this vid, we'll see why those claims are in vain. In the Gospels, the risen Jesus presents several proofs of his status as a resurrected being. He eats fish and he encourages his disciples to touch him. According to second skin theory advocates, if Paul were really defending a traditional view of the resurrection body, he would have appealed to these events. But it would be a mistake to assume that the Corinthian objectors had not, in their own arguments, taken into account these very points and made their own explanations that mere reassertion by Paul would not suit. If the questions are about the metaphysical nature of the body, answers to questions like these would be pointless, and really wouldn't have advanced Paul's argument. On the other hand, questions about the content of the resurrection body, Paul does properly answer with his analogies to proper kinds of bodies for specific places. He obviously cannot answer with a molecular analysis of a resurrected cell, but he can answer that he and others have seen a resurrection body, which in turn indicates that it had no problems of function such as the objections would suppose it would. Paul can also answer with analogies from nature, showing that God has the creative power to provide vessels appropriate to function. A second source critics claim Paul would have used is the Jewish Talmud, where there was a certain amount of discussion about the resurrection body. This argument fails from the start because the Talmud dates to a time hundreds of years after Paul. But even if it didn't, the arguments from the Talmud would have been irrelevant to Paul's purposes. The questions asked in the Talmud are of an entirely different order from the ones Paul is answering. For example, the Talmud answers questions such as whether a person will rise naked or clothed, or whether they will still have defects such as a missing limb. These are far more pedestrian than the question Paul does answer, with what kind of body do they come? The rabbis were not confronting the same questions Paul was, on the same level Paul was. Finally, it must be assumed that Paul, if he knew of such arguments, agreed with them and found them sound. There are a small number of other critical arguments of this type, but they're rather more obscure than the ones we've just looked at. Up next, though, we'll see where the rubber meets the road for the second skin reading of Paul's works, and see how Paul himself directly contradicts it. See you then.